it sounds too melodramatic to be true, but in fact it is true that the Federal Reserve in the last 2 or 3 years created the same pattern of control over money that led to the crash of 1929.
William Greider, author of Secrets of the Temple. Your book is subtitled How the Federal Reserve Runs the Country. Have we been wrong to think it was the politicians all along?
At least half wrong, yes. Strange as that seems. Without going into all the esoterica of what the Federal Reserve, the central bank, actually does, in the largest frame, it regulates money and interest rates, and that is one of the most immediate and powerful influences that the government has over the real economy, workers, producers, stores, etc., simply by manipulating the price of money, which inevitably changes the price of almost every other transaction. And it's insulated from the politicians quite deliberately. So yes.
The notes on the book jacket suggest that in some ways the Federal Reserve is, I'm quoting the jacket now, is more secretive than the CIA and more powerful than the President and Congress. Is that really the case?
Sounds grandiose, I know, but I think that's right. I thought about that a long time, and it is like the CIA in many ways in that it's run by a community of experts, technocrats who have skills and knowledge which are not generally available. Its secrecy is even greater than the CIA's in the sense that the CIA at least has to go to the Congress on a fairly regular basis, share its plans with the Congress, albeit in secret meetings of the Intelligence Committee, get an annual appropriation, which is a powerful lever. If Congress doesn't like what the CIA is doing in Nicaragua, it says, thou shalt not spend money for this. The Federal Reserve has none of those controls. The Federal Reserve is required to testify regularly before Congress, but it is not required to reveal its secret deliberations or even its real expectations for what's going to happen to the economy. And more importantly, it makes its own budget. It does not submit to the appropriations process that every other agency of government must submit to. And as the Federal Reserve well understands, that's real power and real protection from both presidents and Congress. What the Fed discovered quite haltingly over a period of 2 decades was that the power to do that was really the power to manipulate the whole economy. And that is to stimulate or restrain, and that its actions fed directly into interest rates in financial markets all over the place, and from financial markets into the transactions of labor, business, consumers, and so forth. That wasn't instant knowledge on anybody's part. And as they grasped that, nobody had sufficient cause to say, well, wait a minute, that ought to be done by somebody else, or it ought to be done in a more democratic manner. And in addition, I think both political parties understood that this is really the fulcrum between debtors and creditors, between the people with a lot of wealth and the people with none, between labor and capital. It's a very deep political transaction that goes on in this management of money. And so the compromise, which was struck in 1913, held over many years. I mean, there have been many fluctuations in that, but basically no one since, and the Fed has had critics on both sides, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democratic, but no one since has ever been able to put together a powerful enough coalition to undo it.
Another quote from your book, you say, the Federal Reserve System was the crucial anomaly at the very core of representative democracy. Why was it an anomaly, and why has it become so crucial?
Well, it's an anomaly because our civic mythology tells us that the people are sovereign, that the people ultimately choose their representatives, and that those representatives must be accountable at regular times. That's why we have elections every 2 years for the federal government, every 4 years for the president. The Federal Reserve is exempt from that process, and yet it has enormous political power. Now, those who believe the mythology would say, oh, well, that's not quite right, because this is just a technical function. It's not politics. Well, when I mean, I think that's rubbish because it's political in the sense that here is an agency making very large public choices for us that will reward some interests and damage other interests. That may not be their motive in doing it, but that's the result. That's political in the deepest meaning of the word. And when you go behind the economics of the Fed and look at what, which choices they make, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, what you really come to see is that these are choices of values. Paul Volcker had a certain set of values which he brought to government and imposed quite successfully. And you can argue that the country on the whole supported those values. But the people who were damaged, the victims from both the deep recession and from the money policy that followed, have no access to express their grievances. There's no recourse. I mean, they can write angry letters to the Fed, which they do, or they can call their congressman, and their congressman is likely to tell them, well, yes, isn't the Fed terrible, but we can't do anything about it. And all I'm suggesting is that there's something wrong in a system that's sequestered with that much power. Then I would just add in passing, the word anomaly stops people. And I first heard that used by a former president of a Federal Reserve Bank. I mean, they understand that perfectly. And it's not simply quaint and accidental that money was first coined in the temples of all the classical civilizations. And the Fed, even though it is a very highly rationalistic institution with lots of mathematical equations and economists and so forth, what one would think is the opposite of religious, actually cloaks itself in much of the same style and thought processes. I mean, I'll run through just a couple of them. The mystique of the central bank is a phrase that's used even by Fed people quite unconsciously of what that suggests, as though there's some mystery going on here. And secondly, the Federal Reserve Board, though it does it in a prosaic way, has the same role of ancient temple priests, that is a prophetic leader that says, this is how we think the future looks, this is what we think will happen to the economy. And that's a kind of prophecy making that the Fed does just as ancient temples did. I spent a lot of time, in the heart of my reporting, was interviewing Federal Reserve Board governors, presidents of the 12 Federal Reserve banks, and the chairman. I found them pretty straightforward. They didn't tell me their deepest secrets, but they answered my questions in a very straightforward way. I found the Fed staff, with some notable exceptions, but particularly here in Washington, much more reluctant to be sort of open and straightforward about what was going on.
You talk about the news media in the book, and you say about their coverage of the Fed. You say the news media rarely paid much attention to what was said by the Federal Reserve governors, and if one judge of the central bank is solely on the basis of its uncritical press coverage, the Federal Reserve appeared to be the only agency of government that never made mistakes. The media's job of covering the Fed not so good?
Yeah, I think so. I'm sure there are a lot of financial reporters who will be offended by that, but and part of what I mean is that they don't make much of an effort to really speak to the broader audience of citizens about Fed policy. Example of the speeches. One of the things I did, and it was quite tedious, but I got virtually every speech that all of these governors had made. But if you read them through very patiently, and particularly read them in series, what did this guy say 6 months ago and what is he saying now, it's very helpful and very informative. So I would think the very least newspapers ought to do is start covering those speeches more effectively.
Wraps up with the so-called Black Monday of last October with the steep stock market decline. Do you attribute that directly to the policies of Paul Volcker and the Fed?
Well, I think people will be arguing over this for the rest of our lives probably, but I think if you say that the stock market crash was essentially a symptom of the deeper disorders that we are now confronted with, which is, I think, the right way to look at it. And then you ask, all right, what was a triggering event that produced this shock and collapse of faith? Then I think the Federal Reserve is a leading candidate, yes, because it sounds too melodramatic to be true, but in fact it is true that the Federal Reserve in the last 2 or 3 years created the same pattern of control over money that led to the crash of 1929. And without going into the complications of it, 2 years ago, they let the money supply grow enormously, partly because they had no choice unless they wanted to force a recession, which of course they didn't want to do in 1985. I don't question their judgment about that, but money supply flows, balloons, not much is happening in the real economy of work and production. So it flows into financial speculation. That's the beginning of this really wild run-up at Wall Street, particularly in the stock market. Then in 1986, the Fed tried to take some of that liquidity out of the economy, out of the financial system, and money supply was held down. In September, having held money growth very low, it raised the discount rate for the first time in 3 years. At the very time the stock market was trying to go up again and the real economy was coming back, reviving. Those two things put pressure on the total liquidity in the economy. People need more money. Transactions are rising, prices are rising, blah, blah, blah. So they're pulling back at that same time, and it's like a traumatic effect on the stock market. And there are a number of astute market analysts who that's exactly their diagnosis of what happened. Nobody in politics, much less the Federal Reserve Board, has yet addressed that, which I find fascinating. I think if we have a congressional hearing 6 months or a year or 2 years from now, which is what happened after 1929, that's going to be one of the leading theories about what happened.
Your book looks back at the past 8 years in amazing detail. In the several minutes that we have left, let's look ahead. What would your recommendations be to the administration, to the Fed, to keep some of those problems from happening again, and what do you think will happen down the road?
Well, I think we're in a grave economic crisis right now. And the first problem, the first danger, is to avoid a recession. And I think people have an idea that, well, you have a recession, then you have another recession. There's so many weakened debtors around, not just our economy, but the world's, particularly those LDC countries with all that debt, that if the U.S. goes into a recession now, it could get out of control. I don't know that it'll get out of control. I can't say that but I think it's a risk we ought not to take. So that's the first thing. Then I think there's a much more general reconstruction, which is going to take many years. And most people know all of the elements of that, of the debts, the federal debt, and the trade deficits, and so forth. I would add a couple of others. One is the maldistribution of incomes. This is an old idea that got learned in the 20s, and most everyone has forgotten. But the fact is, when you have a long period of maldistributing incomes, that is, the folks at the top get a larger share and everybody else gets a smaller share, eventually it erodes the strength of your economy. And I think that's what's happened in the last couple of years. For the Fed, I would say, you've got to invent a system of coordination and accountability, and the best, most direct solution for that is to simply declare that the Federal Reserve is a sub-agency of the Treasury Department. Make the president responsible for it. Bring it out into the open. Let's debate about these things. I'm not sure that any of what I've just said is going to happen.